Good Monday, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for October the 2nd. Today we are reading together in 2 Kings chapter 17, which is going to give us all the details about the fall of the northern tribes of Israel, about the fall of Samaria, about Israel's last king, and it gives us a little synopsis as to why it happens. And then what about the land? What happens to the land after the people are deported from Israel into their land of captivity? We're going to notice all of that today here within the text of 2 Kings chapter 17. Let's read together here 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse number 1. In the 12th year of Judah's king Ahaz, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king over Israel in Samaria. Remember, he conspired against the previous king. He did, verse 2 says, what was evil in Yahweh's sight, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. So he wasn't the worst king that Israel ever had. King Shalmaneser of Assyria attacked him, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria caught Hoshea in a conspiracy. What had Hoshea done? He had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and had not paid tribute to the king of Assyria as in previous years. Therefore, the king of Assyria arrested him and put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the whole land, marched up to Samaria, and besieged it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Halal, along with Habor, Gozan's river, and the cities of the Medes. This disaster happened because the people of Israel sinned against Yahweh their God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and because they worshipped other gods. They lived according to the customs of the nations that Yahweh had dispossessed before the Israelites, and according to what the kings of Israel did. The Israelites secretly did these things against Yahweh their God that were not right. They built high places. In all their towns, from a watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. They burned incense there on all the high places, just like the nations that Yahweh had driven out before them had done. They did evil things, angering Yahweh. They served idols, although Yahweh had told them, you must not do this. Still, Yahweh warned Israel and Judah through every prophet and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commands and statutes according to the whole law I commanded your ancestors and sent to you through my servants the prophets. But they would not listen. Instead, they became obstinate, like their ancestors who did not believe Yahweh their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenant he had made with their ancestors and the warnings he had given them. They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. What a statement there. We'll come back to that surely. Following the surrounding nations, Yahweh had commanded them not to imitate. They abandoned all the commands of Yahweh their God. They made cast images for themselves, 2 calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed in worship to all the stars in the sky and served Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire and practiced divination and interpreted omens. They devoted themselves to do what was evil in Yahweh's sight and angered him. Therefore, Yahweh was very angry with Israel, and he removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah remains. Even Judah did not keep the commands of Yahweh their God, but lived according to the customs Israel had practiced. So Yahweh rejected all the descendants of Israel, punished them, and handed them over to the plunderers until he had banished them from his presence. When Yahweh tore Israel from the house of David, Israel made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, king. Then Jeroboam led Israel away from the following Yahweh and caused them to commit grave sin. The Israelites persisted in all their sins that Jeroboam committed and did not turn away from them. Finally, Yahweh removed Israel from his presence, just as he had declared to all his servants the prophets. So Israel has been exiled to Assyria from their homeland to this very day. Gives us a bit of a timestamp about when, again, the king's story was written during the time of Assyrian captivity, it seems. Then the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in places of the Israelites in the cities of Samaria. The settlers took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. When they first arrived there, they did not fear Yahweh. So the Lord, Yahweh, sent lions among them, which killed some of them. The settlers said to the king of Assyria, the nations that you have deported and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the requirements of the God of the land. Therefore, he has sent lions among them that are killing them because the people did not know the requirements of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria issued a command, send back one of the priests you deported. Have him go and live there so he can teach them the requirements of the God of the land. So one of the priests they had deported came and lived in Bethel, and he began to teach them how they should fear Yahweh. Wonder how good that particular teaching was, considering the spiritual condition of Israel that led to their deportation. Nevertheless, verse 29, but the people of each nation were still making their own gods in the cities where they lived and putting them in the shrines of the high places that the people of Samaria had made. The men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth, and the men of Cuth made Nergal. The men of Hamath made Ashima. The Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak, and the Severites burned their children in the fire to Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. They feared Yahweh, but they also made from their ranks priests for the high places who were working for them at the shrines of the high places. They feared Yahweh, but they also worshiped their own gods according to the practice of the nations from which they had been deported. They are still observing the former practices to this day. Some of them fear Yahweh or observe the statutes and ordinances, the law and the commandments that Yahweh had commanded the descendants of Jacob, whom he had given the name Israel. Yahweh made a covenant with Jacob's descendants and commanded them, do not fear other gods, do not bow and worship to them, do not serve them, do not sacrifice to them. Instead, fear Yahweh, who brought you up from the land of Egypt with great power and an outstretched arm. You are to bow down to him, and you are to sacrifice to him. You are to be careful always to observe the statutes and the ordinances, the law and the commandments he wrote for you. Do not fear other gods. Do not forget the covenant that I have made with you. Do not fear other gods, but fear Yahweh your God, and he will rescue you from all your enemies. However, these nations will not listen, but continued observing their former practices. They feared Yahweh, but also served their gods. Still today, their children and grandchildren continue doing as their ancestors did. And that is 2 Kings chapter 17, the last king of Israel and the fall of the northern tribes. The last king is King Hoshea. And going back to the end of, chapter 15, we see that Hoshea had made had organized a conspiracy against Pekah, the son of Remaliah, and he killed him and ended up becoming king in his place. And concerning Hoshea and his reign, he did what was evil in Yahweh's sight, which is no surprise for us. That's, again, the consistent theme for all of the kings of Israel. But he did not do what was evil like the kings who preceded him. So he was bad, but he wasn't the worst. He was bad, but he wasn't the worst. One of his great failures, though, certainly was the fact that he surrendered and was willing to be a vassal for the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser. But once a conspiracist, always a conspiracist, it seems, for he made another conspiracy. And this time the conspiracy was to try to get an agreement between himself and So, the king of Egypt, so they might be able to repel Assyria. Because if you just think about in your mind, the land of Israel, Assyria would be in the northern part. There's Israel along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, and then below there would be Egypt. If you want to get to Egypt, you got to go through Israel. So Israel seemed, or at least Hoshea, tried to join themselves to Egypt to try to repel Assyria, but that didn't work. He sought to be strengthened by someone who really couldn't help him. If he really wanted to repel Assyria, Hoshea only had one person to turn to, and that was Yahweh, his God. Well, Yahweh, who should have been his God, but who he rejected through paganistic practices and the like. So he ends up getting arrested, basically, and he is thrown in prison. And the people began the deportation process. The Israel is conquered in about the year 722. This is about 200 years and 19 kings after the reign of Solomon. So it only took 200 years for Israel to collapse because of the horrible leadership that they experienced under all the different kings. The people of Israel, of the northern tribes, Samaria, the cities of Samaria, they are deported. They're deported to not only Assyria, but also to other various places that are mentioned there within the text. And this would have been a very humiliating, extremely humiliating journey. History books tell us that they would have been stripped naked, and then they would have been joined together in very uncomfortable ways. I believe I heard one person mention that there would have been fishing hooks involved in the joining together of the people and making them march from their homeland to their land of captivity. And all you're doing is you're trying to break them down. You're trying to humiliate them. You're trying to make their will to survive, basically to disappear, so that you can dominate them and conquer this people that now belong to you. And we might be thinking, well, how could this happen? How in the world could once proud Israel, again, think about the heyday of David and Solomon, how could that kingdom be stripped naked and made to march away from their homelands? Well, it all gets back to the fact that they sinned against Yahweh, their God. This disaster, as we see in verse number 7, happened because they sinned against Yahweh, their God. They did all of these things. They began doing these things secretly. They secretly did these things against Yahweh, their God, which is just so silly to think that he doesn't see them. He certainly does. He sees their secret sins. He sees our secret sins. And man, that's a terrifying thought, isn't it? We can hide things from everybody else, but God knows them. That is very scary to consider, and really should stand as a very strong motivation for us to really be mindful, to know that we can't get away with anything. We might fool everybody else, but God, he knows, and he will hold us accountable. They sinned in every way, setting up Asherah poles. They burned incense in high places. They did evil things. They served idols. They did all these things like the nations around them, even though Yahweh had dispossessed them and had warned them against doing those things. He had warned through the prophet and through the seer to both Israel and Judah both, turn from your evil ways and keep my commands and statutes according to the whole law I commanded you. I commanded your ancestors and sent to you through my servants the prophets, but they would not listen. Instead, they became obstinate like their ancestors who did not believe. They became like oxen who stiffened their necks and would not go. But what happens to an ox who stiffens his neck? Well, he receives the goad. And Israel certainly received the goad. They received the punishment for their sins. They followed worthless idols. This is a tremendous statement here. They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. Wow. You are, as some have said before, we've heard the saying, you are what you eat. Well, really, you are what you worship. And if you have the opportunity to worship the Most High God, what a blessed position that is. But if you worship worthless things instead, what good is worshiping a worthless thing? Does that not make you worthless yourself? Certainly it does. Certainly we see that here in the history of Israel. They abandoned all the commands that Yahweh had made. Again, making cast images, the two poles, the two calves, the Asherah poles, worshiping the stars, worshiping the Baals, sacrificing their sons and daughters, practicing divination and interpreting omens. They devoted themselves to do what was evil in Yahweh's sight, and they angered him. They basically ignored. It doesn't even seem like they ignored. It's almost as if they opened up the book of Deuteronomy and did their best to break all the instruction of Yahweh. Again, it's not even just that they were ignorant. It seems like they were trying to. They were so good at it. Again, it almost makes you think that they were doing it on purpose. Therefore, Yahweh was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only Judah remained. So there's the United Kingdom, as we're doing in our young adults class. We're doing some trying to do our best to remember the time periods. You have the United Kingdom, then you have the divided kingdom, then you have Judah alone, and that's kind of where we're at right here. But then we see in verse 19 that even Judah did not keep the commands of Yahweh their God, so they get taken into captivity as well. We're going to see that as we progress through 2 Kings to see that unfold too. But right now, at this point in the narrative, Israel's gone. Judah's just hanging on by a thread. And all this happened because, again, they rejected him. They rejected him. So verses 21 through 23 just give us a very short summation of specifically Israel's history. That whenever there was the divided kingdom, whenever Yahweh tore Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam king. He introduced the paganistic practices, and I want to highlight just a few words here. They persisted in all the sins that Jeroboam committed and did not turn away from them. Why? Because there was no leadership worth anything. All the leadership was terrible. They led the people in sin continually. So finally, Yahweh removed Israel from his presence, just as he had declared that he would do. Yahweh made a promise. He made a promise going all the way back to Deuteronomy. He made a promise going all the way back to Abraham. That if you do not follow my covenant, if you are disloyal to the covenant, if you are unfaithful, if you are untrusting, you will receive the curses. Here are the curses coming to fruition. So Israel has been exiled to Assyria from their homeland to this very day. Again, the book of the Kings seems to be written to basically answer the question I asked after verse 6. How could this happen? The Israelites might be asking, why are we here? We've heard about the promised land. Why are we not there? Well, here's why. Here's the story as to why. But what about the land itself? What happens to the land after deportation? Well, as was the practice, the conquering people sent other conquered people into the land. Again, you're trying to break them from having any sort of loyalty to the homeland, so they're easier to control. As he sends all these people from all these various places, they come into Samaria, they settle there. And the text says that they did not fear Yahweh. So what does Yahweh do? He sends lions among them, which killed some of them. Some speculate that part of this might have been as they left all these dead bodies, that the lions came out from the hills and started eating the bodies, and then had a taste for living flesh as well. So went after them too. All this, though, under the control, certainly, of Yahweh. So they send word back to Shalmaneser. And they say, listen, we don't know the customs of this land. We need to be able to fear their God and worship their God. So you need to send somebody back that can teach us. And think about it, sending back a priest of this people who worship Yahweh in a paganistic way. What do you think he's going to teach them? Well, he's going to teach them the paganistic practices, which is why we see them fearing Yahweh, yes, but also worshiping in a pagan way, and probably worshiping Yahweh in a pagan way. So it's not just that they are worshiping pagans, but they're also worshiping Yahweh in a paganistic way. And really what we have here in verses 29 through 33, what we have here is the roots and really the first form of Samaritan religious practice. Remember Jesus interacting with a Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. This is where all this comes from. It all stems from what happened here after the deportation of Israel from their portion of the promised land. Unfortunately, they're still, as the text tells us, they're still doing this today. They're not observing anything that Yahweh said, or at least they're not going back to the pure worship that was the instruction given to Yahweh. Because think about it, as they're settling into this land, it's not just the foreigners. There's also the lowest of the low who are left within the land, that the poor are left there. And there certainly is intermarrying between them, which leads to those who are known as mixed race in the Samaritans and elsewhere. So there should have been an understanding from the Israelites that were still there about the pure religious practice of worship before Yahweh, but they didn't listen. And these foreigners certainly were not going to listen. So because of that, because of them continuing to observe their foreign practices, they did not receive the blessings of the land. The land itself should have been a blessing, and everything from the land should have been a blessing, but they did not receive it because they did not worship Yahweh well at all. So again, still today it says their children and grandchildren continue doing as their fathers did. You're here because of the sins, but the same sins that got you here, they're continuing to be carried out in the land even to this day. Wow, it's really crazy to read all this, to think about everything that we've covered in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, going back into 1 and 2 Samuel as well, and to know this is the end for Israel. They're overtaken by Assyria, pulled into captivity by Assyria, all of it because they would not serve Yahweh. They thought they could get away with it in secrets, and it ends up making its way into the light. They persisted in all their evil ways because they did not have good leadership. So many lessons for us to learn. So many lessons for us to learn. May we not just read these things together, but may we meditate upon them and not make the same mistakes that we have seen here today. Of course, everything that was written, as Paul says, Romans was written for our instruction. Certainly, this is a text written for our instruction. May we not forsake Yahweh and his commands and his ordinances, but may we faithfully serve him well through Jesus. I appreciate you tuning in for this reading today. Hope that you'll do so again tomorrow as we read together from 2 Kings chapter 18. We're going to now focus our attention on Judah and specifically King Hezekiah. We'll be reading about him beginning tomorrow. Hope to see you then. Take care and God bless.